All right, we're on to meditation three. Meditation three is pretty much all about God. You should have already watched the video where I tell you a little bit about some of the traditional attempts to prove that God exists. And in that video, I also tell you why Descartes wants to try to prove or thinks he has to prove that God exists. I want to follow up on that or deepen that a little bit by taking a look at the text. Okay, so what Descartes says is, at the beginning of Meditation 3, that he knows one thing for sure now. He knows that he exists and that he's a thinking thing. He also makes the point, something I'll discuss in a later video about Descartes. This thing that I've already mentioned, that not only does he know that he exists, he knows that the things in his mind exist. Right? So he says, even if the objects of my sensory experience and imagination don't exist, still sensory perception and imagination themselves, considered simply as mental events, certainly do occur in me. So even if his ideas about the world are inaccurate, he still has those ideas. That's going to be vital for this argument. He says he knows that he exists because when he considers the claim that he exists, he knows that, or he has like a feeling that it's vivid and clearly true. There's this extended translation discussion at the very beginning of the translation I've given you, which I actually really like. Typically, this claim is talked about, or typically when Descartes is translated into English, it said that Descartes is sure that he exists because he has a clear and distinct perception. And that can be a little confusing as to what that means. And I do like the translation here better, which says that he has a vivid and clear perception of the truth of the claim that he exists. So it's clear, meaning it's like it's not confused with any other idea. Right? And it's vivid, like the truth of it sort of stands out. And what we're really talking about here is basically the same kind of thing Aristotle was talking about when he talked about intuition. So remember that Aristotle believed that after you had made a lot of observations, after you had developed the universals, you needed intuition to get you that last step. You needed nous, or the understanding, as something separate from induction to get you all the way to true universal claims. You could have universal concepts by induction. You could even have plausible hypotheses linking those concepts by induction. But to know for sure, you needed intuition. What Descartes is saying here is that the fundamental truth, the fundamental piece of knowledge upon which all other things that you know are going to be based, which is that you exist and that the mental events and items in your mind exist, that is known by intuition. And so he considers the possibility that maybe everything that's vivid and clear is true. Or maybe everything that appears vivid and clear to him is true. If that's the case, if he can trust all his vivid and clear, or in traditional translations, clear and distinct perceptions, then it seems like he has a method now of getting knowledge back, of digging himself out of this hole, right, that he's got himself in because of the evil demon argument. But he points out that in the past, he's felt sure about things that turned out to be doubtful. Right? Everything that the dreaming argument and the evil demon argument put into doubt, or at least some of the things that they put into doubt, were things that he, prior to this, thought were clear and clearly true. And at this point, I want to bring your attention to one of the things he talks about as an example here. He says, but what about when I was considering something simple and straightforward in arithmetic or geometry? For example, that 2 plus 3 makes 5. Didn't I see those things clearly enough to accept them as true? Indeed, the only reason I could find for doubting them was this. Perhaps some God could have made me so as to be deceived even in these matters. And then what he basically says, that's the evil demon doubt again. Remember, he introduces the evil demon doubt as God might be tricking me. Well, maybe God wouldn't do that, but an evil demon would, so let's go. What he says is, if he can remove his doubt about the evil demon, then he'll be able to trust his vivid and clear perceptions, or clear and distinct perceptions. And so he's going to try to set out to prove that God exists. So and And you might think, well, isn't he worried about God? Well, he's going to try to prove that a particular kind of God exists, a God who wouldn't deceive him. Because remember, he was like throwing these ideas around in the first meditation, like, well, maybe God's tricking me. Maybe God wouldn't do that, but an evil demon would, and it's possible there's an evil demon. Right? He admits a little later on in this chapter, he has no evidence there's an evil demon. So he says the cause of doubt is weak, but he wants to eliminate even weak doubts. So if he could prove that a God exists who doesn't deceive him, and that this God would, prevent any other being from systematically deceiving him, then he can trust his clear and distinct or vivid and clear perceptions. And from there, he can move on to rebuild his knowledge. So what this is about is proving that God exists so that we can prove that our intuition is sound. The same kind of faculty Aristotle had in his account of knowledge, but notice that Aristotle restricted it. Right? Aristotle said intuition or nous only plays a role at the very, very end of the process of induction. And it only plays a role in knowing the truth of fundamental or foundational universal principles. Right? So you have to do all the work of the observation. You then have to go through and do the induction. And only after you've done the induction, which is a very long, arduous process, only then can you put yourself in a position where intuition can make that vital difference and get you to genuine knowledge of universal truths. So Aristotle allows intuition into his theory of knowledge, but he tries to restrict its application as much as possible. Right? So Aristotle is not going to allow someone to say that intuition shows them that, for example, a particular object exists. Descartes is using that kind of intuition as the foundational case because, of course, the thing that he thinks he knows more certainly than anything else is that he exists. And he says he knows that because he has a vivid and clear perception of it being true, or in other words, an intuition that he exists. Now, you might wonder, if he knows that he exists by intuition or vivid and clear perception, and he needs to prove that God exists in order to trust vivid and clear perceptions, doesn't he have to prove that God exists before he proves he exists? Like if intuition is in doubt, then and proving that God exists, an all good God exists, is the only way to remove that doubt. It seems like he has to prove God first, but he can't prove God first for reasons I'm about to make clear. Also keep in mind that if we're going to need to prove that God exists in order to have reason to trust our intuition or our vivid and clear perceptions, and perception here is not visual perception. Just want to be clear about this. We often use perception that way. Descartes' not using it that way. He means something here pretty much the same as intuition. All right, so if we need to prove that God exists in order to prove that our intuitions or vivid and clear perceptions are reliable, then it seems like we're also not going to be able to use vivid and clear perceptions in order to prove that God exists. But as you'll notice, this is exactly what Descartes does. What I'm telling you about here is something that's often called the Cartesian circle, and I'll come back to it after we run through Descartes' argument for God's existence, which is, at least in Meditation 3, a version of the cosmological argument, but a weird version of the cosmological argument. Because usually when you make a cosmological argument, you can rely on the existence of ordinary physical things, right? So like, here's a plate, right? And I can say, well, what caused this plate to exist? And if I'm Aristotle, actually I have a bunch of different potential causes, but the most straightforward one is, well, somebody had a kiln and they made this, right? It's pottery. It's like, I don't know what exactly it's made out of. And then you ask, well, all right, what caused the potter who had the kiln to exist? And you say, well, their parents, and then so on and so forth all the way back in time. Descartes can't do that because Descartes doesn't believe that he has any reason or he has sufficient justification to believe in physical objects. So the only thing left are going to be his ideas and himself. All right, so the argument is going to start with evidence coming from Descartes' ideas. Now, Descartes classifies his ideas in various ways. One of those ways of classifying them is ideas that are basically, as he says, sensory images, although there's no reason to restrict it to images as in like visual images. Basically just ideas that are basically of the external world itself. And then there are ideas about more abstract stuff, abstract propositions and whether or not you believe them true or false. But the more important one for our purposes in this video is that he breaks his ideas into the category of the innate, the invented, and what I'll call the, or we'll say externally caused. So innate ideas, Descartes believes in them. That's going to set him apart from somebody like Aristotle. It's going to put him in good company with Plato. Invented ideas are just ideas that we come up with ourselves. An example would be the idea of a centaur, right? The idea of a centaur is not innate. We're not born with it. Descartes wouldn't think. What happened is we created this idea really out of two other ideas, the idea of a horse and the idea of a man, and we just like pushed them together in our head. Those two categories of ideas are completely unproblematic for Descartes at this point. He knows he has ideas. He doesn't know at this point, he thinks, anything about the external world. So these two classes of ideas, the ideas that have always been in his mind, that he was have existed in his mind either as long as he's existed or that he created, those are unproblematic because they don't require him to believe in anything he doesn't already claim to know, which is that he exists and his ideas exist. It's externally caused ideas which are going to be more interesting. Basically, if Descartes can prove that he has some ideas which must have an external cause, then he can prove that there are things out in the world that exist. But when he goes through his different ideas, what he ends up deciding is there's one idea in particular that seems like it has to be externally caused, and that is the idea of God. Now, why does the idea of God have to be externally caused? Well, as Descartes says, he says, now it is obvious by the natural light that the total cause of something must contain at least as much reality as does the effect. This is the fundamental principle that the whole argument for God in this meditation is based on, and it's a really odd principle. He uses examples of something can't cause fire unless it has heat in it. Something can't cause a stone unless it has as much reality as the stone has. And you might wonder, like, well, what does that mean? Because here's an ordinary way to think of reality. Things are real or they're not, right? It's binary. It's a 1 or a 0. Either something is real or it is not real. What's real? Phones are real. What's not real? Unicorns. Right? And that there's no like gradations of reality. But Descartes thinks there are gradations of reality. He thinks some things have more reality in them, or perfection, it's sometimes translated, than other things do. This is not an idea that starts with Descartes. This was an idea that was very common throughout the Middle Ages. So as much as Descartes sometimes likes to claim that he's breaking with the Middle Ages, he is actually employing a lot of medieval scholastic thought. Scholasticism is the name we give to philosophically motivated theology, sort of in the Middle Ages university system. It's not that important for now. But he's taking a lot of medieval principles and using them in this meditation. All right, so he says, any effect can't have more reality than its cause. So if X causes Y, Descartes' going to say each thing has its own level of reality, its own degree of reality. And the degree of reality in Y can never be greater than the degree of reality in X. And I honestly don't know what to do to make this principle plausible. I'm not really going to try. The reason is that I think the argument for God's existence in Meditation 5 is stronger than this one. Descartes really has himself in a bind here if he wants to offer a cosmological argument, which this is, because here's what he's going to say. Let's say Y is the idea of God. He is absolutely sure that this exists. He's not absolutely sure that that God exists, right, at the beginning of Meditation 3, but he is absolutely sure the idea of God exists. And he thinks the idea must have a cause. And he thinks, well, it couldn't be that he came up with the idea. It couldn't be that this is one of those invented ideas. And that's not because he's unaware of having ever invented it. Sometimes people attribute to Descartes the view that everything that goes on in your mind is something you can directly accessed, or that is sort of introspectively available, that like nothing in your own mind is hidden from you. People sometimes say this about Descartes. He explicitly denies that in this meditation. He says there might be some faculty in the mind that without me knowing creates ideas, right? So just the fact that he doesn't remember coming up with the idea of God, he thinks that doesn't prove that it's not an idea he invented. What does is this principle, he says, that the cause must have as much reality as the effect. And here's what he realizes. The idea of God involves the idea of infinite perfection or reality. Here, I'm going to rewrite that. All right, so I rewrote it. The idea of God is the idea of something that has infinite perfection and reality. And what Descartes is aware of is that he himself doesn't have that. So the reason he thinks he couldn't have invented this idea is that he lacks the ability, right? Because he is too limited. He is a finite being. And notice that the examples he gives to justify this principle, that the cause must have at least as much reality as the effect. The examples he gives are examples of one real thing causing another real thing to happen. So like something causing a fire. He's like, well, it's got to have heat in it. So suppose a lightning strike causes a fire. What Descartes would have to say is, well, there has to be at least as much potential heat in the lightning strike as there is actual heat in the fire. Or maybe you would want to say, it's the lightning strike and the dried fuel on the ground, like the dead branches and leaves and stuff like that. That together must have as much potential heat as the fire. And there you can maybe, if you make that a little more specific and things like that, you can maybe make that plausible. But what he's saying here is that the real thing that causes the idea must have as much reality as the thing the idea is an idea of. And so if you have an idea of infinite perfection or infinite reality, the cause of that idea has to actually have infinite perfection or infinite reality. And because that's not him, he knows this is not an invented idea. He also thinks it can't be innate. I mean, think about what you're saying when you're saying it's innate. An idea is innate. You're saying, well, I was born with it, right? I've always had it. That doesn't actually tell you what the cause of it is. If you think back to Plato, Plato didn't just say, well, it's innate. He wanted to give a causal account of where this innate knowledge came from. So he told this story about reincarnation. Right? Just saying something's innate doesn't tell you where it comes from. You have to provide an extra theory. What I told you about with Plato is modern day scientists who believe in innate features of the mind give an evolutionary story, right? Because that'll be the cause. So just saying that it's innate doesn't really answer the question of what the cause is. It's either you, and you did it somehow before you were born, or it's something else besides you, right? which means it ends up going back to externally caused. And so what Descartes thinks, first of all, is the idea of God proves that there must be something outside of him, other than him, that caused him to have the idea. Right? So that's one thing. So just the idea of God proves that something besides him exists. It also, he thinks, proves that God really does exist, because there's nowhere else our idea of God could have come from. Now you might think, well, of course there's someplace my idea of God could have come from. There's all sorts of powerful things I can imagine that, the idea doesn't come from the real thing, right? Like I can imagine Thor from the Avengers, right? And he's super strong and he can survive in space unaided and he can summon massive amounts of electrical energy at will, right? He can open portals through dimensions, apparently. Got all sorts of powerful abilities that I don't have. Plausibly, if God has more reality than Descartes, and so that the idea of God has more reality than Descartes himself, then Thor, well, not, up to the level of the Christian God, Thor's got to have more power and reality than me, so I couldn't have come up with Thor. But yeah, people did come up with Thor, right? I mean, unless you really believe Thor's real, which you shouldn't, because he's not. Unless you think Thor is real, you know that what happened is people just started telling stories. And you can get to the idea of Thor by starting out with something that's not actually anywhere near as impressive as Thor. Start out with a normal person and just say, all right, make him stronger and make him stronger again and give him good hair. Right? Well, not that much good hair. Cut it off. Right? Give him a big old hammer. What can the hammer do? It can shoot lightning. Right? Maybe Thor himself shoots the lightning and the hammer is just there to guide it. And he can fly with the hammer. Right? Stuff like that. You can see how you can start out with something that's not got that much reality and seemingly develop an idea that has as much reality, or more reality rather. What Descartes would probably say about that is, well, if you think about it, what you're really doing is you're not just starting with the idea of an ordinary guy. You're starting out with the idea of an ordinary guy, plus you're starting out with the idea of lightning, and you're pushing those two things together. Now you've got an ordinary guy who can shoot lightning. And you've got an ordinary guy, and then you're pushing together with that the idea of strength enough to throw a car, right? And you're just putting that in there. So really, when you're thinking about all the different ideas you're pulling from here, the total set of ideas has more reality than the thing that resulted from it, right? But more importantly, Descartes doesn't think that we develop the idea of the infinite by starting with some finite thing. This is actually key to the whole argument. What he thinks is we start with the idea of the infinite, and then we get the idea of stuff that's lesser than the infinite by subtracting from the idea of the infinite. Right? So if this circle represents the infinite, then Descartes' idea is we start out with this. It's not really a circle. It looks more like an onion. But we start out with this infinite idea, and we get to a finite idea. Right? So let's say this smaller thing is a finite idea, even though this doesn't make any sense because it's not just like infinity is bigger than a finite number. But whatever. We get to the finite idea, right, which let's say is like that, by just getting rid of the other stuff. So we get the idea of finite things by starting from the idea of God, or of the infinite, rather than starting from the idea of the finite and getting to the infinite. And here again, I'm not going to try to defend this. I don't think this, it doesn't seem to me true at all. Like if you want, like take an example of the natural numbers, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. Right? This is an infinitely long set. This set is an infinite set of infinite size. It seems to me we get the idea of infinity by starting out with a finite number like 1 and saying, well, there's 1, but if you add another one, it's 2. If you add another one, it's 3. If you add another one, it's 4. Add another one, it's 5. And then your mind picks up on the pattern and you realize, well, this operation, the successor operation, right, moving one more along the number line, that doesn't end, right? And then you just give the name infinite to a process like that that doesn't end. The result, or all the things that can be produced by this function or this process that has no end. That seems like getting the idea of the infinite from the finite, but Descartes doesn't think that. And it's vital that he doesn't think that, because if he believed that, then it would be open to saying that the idea of God was invented. The way this argument fundamentally works is by saying there exists a thing, the idea of God. That thing must have a cause, and then ruling out every potential cause other than God itself. And there's certain implausible principles in this, or implausible to me anyway, principles in this argument. Implausible to a lot of other people. Nobody's ever really taken this argument and developed it. Modern day people who try to develop proofs for God's existence almost never use this one. Because, I mean, Descartes put himself in this weird situation where the only thing he can talk about the cause of are his own ideas. Most people don't ever take themselves to be in that situation. But I want to focus on that original principle. Right. It is obvious by natural light that the total cause of something must contain at least as much reality as does the effect. It is obvious by natural light. That's a phrase he uses when he wants to say that there is a clear, distinct perception, or, as in this translation, a vivid and clear perception. And so a premise in the argument for God's existence is something that you can only know by a vivid and clear perception or intuition. So we'll write the principle down. Effects cannot have more reality than their causes. And from this, plus I have an idea of God, which he thinks everyone has. He thinks even atheists have the idea of God. I mean, after all, that's what they're denying exists. So if they have the idea, if they're denying that God exists, they must have an idea of God. That's the thing they're saying is not real. This plus this is supposed to equal God exists. There's other premises in there, but I'm not going to write them all down for now. These are the two key claims. And remember, the reason he wants God exists, he wants to prove that God exists, is he wants to prove that intuition is reliable. But he was proving this by intuition. In a way, he was also proving this by intuition. Because remember, that's the account he gives of how he knows that he exists. And the way he knows that he exists is the same way he knows that he has certain ideas. The cogito, that's in meditation 2. So it looks like you have to believe that intuition is reliable in order to prove these things. But these were the things that proved this. What this is sometimes called is the Cartesian circle. The idea is that Descartes' argumentative strategy, which is to prove that he exists, and then to prove that God exists, so that he can prove that intuition is reliable. But all along he was using intuition to prove that he exists and that God exists, that this is a circular argument. This accusation was put to Descartes during his lifetime. People pointed this out to him. There's a huge debate about this. There are scholars who think Descartes is guilty of arguing in a circle. I think he is. I'm not really a Descartes scholar, though. And there are people who defend Descartes, who say that they know it looks like he's arguing in a circle. They know it looks like circular reasoning, but it's not really. I'm not going to get into that debate. That's a debate for a class that we do offer, History of Modern Philosophy. And that's the right place for that debate. I just want to bring to your attention that there does seem to be, maybe there's not in the last analysis, but there does seem to be a problem with the way the argument in Meditation 3 is going. But at this point, I'm going to move on from Meditation 3, and we're going to start talking about what happens in Meditation 4. But just like with meditation 3, where I had to sort of set it up by telling you some of the theological background, I'm going to have to set this up, or meditation 4 up, by talking about something else from the theological background, the problem of evil. So the next video, shorter than this one, will be on the problem of evil.